I'm Marcus Cole, and welcome to Feral Soul Stories. Here's what I need you to picture. It's 2:47 in the morning. A 130-pound Great Pyrenees named Atlas is asleep inside a house 8 miles from a memory care facility he visits once a week. He is a certified therapy dog. He has a handler. He has a home. There is no reason, none, logically, scientifically, or otherwise, for what happens next. At 2:47 a.m., Atlas wakes. He does not bark. He does not wait. He finds the back door, which has a lever-style handle he has apparently studied at some point with more attention than anyone realized, and he opens it. Security footage from a neighbor's camera shows him clearing the porch steps and turning east without hesitation. He does not sniff the air to orient himself. He already knows where he is going. 13 minutes later, at 3:02 a.m., a man named William, 79 years old, a former professor who has not spoken a word in 3 years, suffers a massive stroke alone in his room on the 3rd floor of Maplewood Memory Care. At that exact moment, Atlas is arriving at Maplewood's front entrance, barking and clawing at the glass doors with a desperation that will wake 3 staff members on the ground floor and register on 2 security cameras. The question that would consume everyone who investigated this story, nurses, neurologists, the handler, William's son, and eventually me, was not simply how Atlas knew. The question was why he knew. Why this dog, this specific dog, would cross 8 miles of unfamiliar roads at 3 in the morning for a man who could not speak, could not recognize family members, could barely track a face across a room. The answer was buried in a box in the back of a closet. A photograph from 2008, Afghanistan, and a white puppy with markings that didn't belong in a war zone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened that night at Maplewood, you need to understand who William was. And you need to understand who Atlas was. Because this is not just a story about a dog sensing a medical emergency. This is a story about a debt 15 years in the making, paid in full at 3:02 on a Tuesday morning in ways that science still cannot fully explain. William Harris had spent 41 years teaching literature at the University of Vermont. Not the kind of teaching that runs on autopilot, the kind that changes people. His former students, and there were thousands of them across 4 decades, had a habit of coming back. They came back when they got married, when they had children, when they published their first books, when they needed someone to remind them why any of it mattered. William had an office with a door that was almost never closed, a habit of brewing terrible coffee that somehow everyone drank anyway, and a capacity for remembering names, papers, and the specific intellectual struggles of students he had taught 15 years prior that bordered on the uncanny. His colleagues at the university had a theory about why his students came back, and it was not complicated. William Harris paid attention. Not the performative attention of someone who wants to be seen paying attention, but the real kind, the kind that notices when a 20-year-old who has been writing deliberately beneath his ability for 3 weeks is finally trying something honest, and says so without ceremony, and then doesn't make a big production of the moment. The kind that remembers a decade later that a particular student had been working through something when she wrote her senior thesis, and asks about it when he runs into her at a conference. Not because it serves any professional purpose, but because he had always wondered how the story came out. He kept a journal for most of his teaching life. Leather-bound books, 1 per academic year, small enough to fit in a jacket pocket. He did not record brilliant thoughts or literary observations, or not primarily. He recorded people, anecdotes, the things students said in seminar that caught him off guard, the papers that made him rethink something he had been certain about for 20 years. He filled 41 of them. They were on a shelf in his study when he left the house in Burlington for the last time. He had also served 2 tours in Vietnam in the early 1970s, back before the teaching began, back before the wife and the 3 children and the house in Burlington with the porch he refinished every spring. He didn't talk about the service often. His children knew he had gone, knew he had come back quieter than he left, knew there were photographs in a box in the study that he would look at sometimes and then not look at for years. His wife Carol understood it in the way that spouses of veterans from that era learned to understand things, quietly, from the side, without pushing. She had learned, in their 43 years of marriage, that there were rooms in William that she did not need to enter, that he had managed alone for a long time before she arrived, and would manage them in the same way after. What she could not manage, and what William himself struggled to articulate in the years before the forgetting began, was the particular weight of having come home when others had not. He was not unique in this. He knew he was not unique in this. But knowing the universality of a feeling does not dissolve it. He had spent decades in a room with young people learning to recognize complexity in language, in character, in the way a story held its meaning, and all of that sophistication had never quite reached the part of him that still, on some mornings, woke with the specific cold and noise and faces of the Mekong Delta in 1972 and could not explain them away with the tools that intellectual life provided. He found ways to carry it. Teaching helped. The relentlessness of the academic calendar, the constant renewal of new students and new texts and new ideas that needed to be worked through gave him a structure that kept the interior organized. Carol helped. His children helped. The garden helped. He had started in 1983, the year Daniel was born, and by the time he retired, it covered most of the backyard and required enough physical attention to occupy the hands on days when the mind needed to be somewhere other than itself. And then, in 2008, when he was 62 years old, he volunteered through a civilian literacy program that worked with the U.S. Army to bring educational resources to rural villages in Afghanistan. He spent 4 months in Kandahar province, technically a civilian, technically non-combat, technically never supposed to be anywhere near anything dangerous. He was William Harris. He was never very good at staying where he was supposed to be. The decision had surprised his family, though perhaps it should not have. He had always had a compulsion toward the places where difficulty was concentrated. Not because he sought danger, but because he had a deeply held conviction, articulated in class one afternoon and remembered by more than one student, that the only honest response to having been given more than you needed was to go where there was less. He had spent 4 decades giving students language. In 2008, with Carol's blessing and Daniel's worried phone calls and the rest of his children's varying degrees of bafflement, he went to give it somewhere that was genuinely scarce. He worked mostly with young men of secondary school age, using a curriculum that had been adapted for rural Afghanistan by people who understood both the subject and the context. His diary was functional at best. He relied heavily on local translators, on the universal vocabulary of mathematics and illustration, and on the capacity that good teachers develop over decades of practice, the ability to know, without words, whether something has landed or not. He was good at this even under the constraints of language and setting. He ran small groups in improvised classrooms, in village buildings that had seen enough history to be exhausted by it, under conditions that the program's orientation materials described as challenging in a specific bureaucratic way that means they were telling you the truth while trying not to alarm you. He loved it. He would not have put it that way to his family, because the word seemed too simple for what it was. But he found in those 4 months something that the decades in Burlington had not quite reached, the feeling of being directly useful, not mediated by curriculum or grades or institutional structures, but immediately, concretely useful. A child understood something today who hadn't understood it yesterday, and the only reason was that William had been in the room. That was the whole thing. That was enough. The puppy appeared in the 3rd week of October. William was at a forward operating base where the literacy program had a liaison office, a practical concession to the reality that civilian operations in a combat zone required proximity to military coordination. He had been there before, knew the layout, knew several of the soldiers by name. He was waiting for a vehicle that would take him back to his primary site when one of the younger soldiers, a specialist from Georgia who had been helping the program with logistics, came around the corner of a vehicle bay and stopped. "Sir," the specialist said, "you're good with animals, right? What makes you think that?" William said, "You just look like you are." The specialist held out his hands. In them, curled into a shape slightly smaller than a football, was a white puppy. Great Pyrenees, though William would not have been able to name the breed. White, with a thick layered coat already remarkable for an animal so young, with paws that were comically large for the rest of him, with dark eyes that were uncertain and searching in the way of something that has been alone for longer than is good for it. Found him outside the wire this morning, the specialist said. Just sitting there. No mother anywhere. Too young to make it on his own. William looked at the puppy. The puppy looked at William. Its ribs were visible under the fur. Its breathing was rapid and shallow in the way of something small that had spent too long in a place that wasn't designed for it. How old? William asked. Maybe 6 weeks. Maybe less. The specialist paused. I can't keep him. They'll make me get rid of him. William, who was 62 years old, who was technically a civilian non-combatant with a vehicle coming in 20 minutes and a program site, expecting him by afternoon, held out his hands. He kept the puppy for 3 weeks. He named him Atlas. He told himself it was provisional, that you didn't name something you couldn't keep, and then went ahead and named it anyway, which told him something about his intentions that he chose not to examine too carefully. He fed him from a bottle source through logistics channels with a determination that both impressed and slightly baffled the soldiers who helped him. He slept with the puppy on a military cot, the small warm weight against his chest, the heartbeat rapid and strong and increasingly confident under his palm. Atlas grew in the way young Great Pyrenees grow, not gradually, but in sudden increments, as if the body was assembling itself in stages and couldn't be bothered to pretend otherwise. By the end of the first week, he was eating soft food. By the end of the second, he was exploring the perimeter of whatever space William occupied with the purposeful curiosity of a creature that had decided the world was interesting and intended to verify this personally. He developed a habit of positioning himself between William and whatever door was closest, facing outward, ears forward, watching the approach with an attention that was disproportionate to the threat level of a forward operating base liaison office. As if he had decided, in whatever way a 6-week-old puppy decides anything, that guarding the threshold was his particular job, that the man who had picked him up out of the Kandahar dust was worth watching over. William photographed him. He had a small camera for the program's documentation, and he took it out one afternoon in mid-October when the light was good, when Atlas had settled on a piece of canvas near the entrance to the office, and asked one of the soldiers to take a picture. William kneeling in the dust, Atlas in his arms, the dog's dark eyes fixed on the camera with a gravity that seemed excessive for a 6-week-old, one oversized paw resting on William's forearm with casual proprietorship. On the left shoulder, a patch of slightly darker fur. Not quite a marking, more a density in the coat, irregular in shape but distinctive enough to catch the eye. He had the photograph printed in a nearby town. He put it in the box with the other Afghanistan photographs. He thought about it, on and off, for 15 years afterward, though by the time the forgetting was fully underway, he would not have been able to tell you that. He left Atlas at the base when his program assignment ended. He had known he would have to. He had known from the first morning he named him. He arranged for the specialist to maintain the feeding schedule, made certain the soldiers on rotation understood the dog's existence and his needs, did all the practical things that responsible people do when they are required to leave something behind. The morning he got in the vehicle, Atlas was at the door of the liaison office. He was sitting, his ears forward, watching William cross the yard and climb in with the same focused attention he gave to everything that moved through his territory. Watching the way he had watched that first morning when William carried him inside from the wire. William did not look back. He thought about it in the years that followed, in the way that people think about the things they didn't do. He mentioned it once to Carol, obliquely, and she had put her hand on his arm and said nothing, which was what she did when she understood everything and there was nothing useful to add. Carol died in 2019, 7 months before the first signs appeared. By the time his eldest son, Daniel, started noticing the gaps, the repeated questions, the lost keys, the moment at Thanksgiving when William called him by his brother's name and then looked confused when corrected, the Alzheimer's had already been working quietly for over a year. William was diagnosed at 74. By 76, he was no longer safe to live alone. By 77, he was at Maplewood Memory Care in Burlington, in a room on the 3rd floor with a window that looked east over the Champlain Valley, where the light in the morning came in gold and the mountains were visible on clear days. By 79, he had not spoken in 3 years. Not a word. Not his name. Not his children's names. Not the names of any of the books he had spent his life teaching. The Alzheimer's had moved through the circuits of language with particular efficiency, leaving him present. His eyes tracked movement. He could still navigate familiar hallways. He responded to music with something that looked like recognition, but silent. Completely, profoundly, unreachably silent. His son Daniel visited every Sunday. He would sit beside his father's wheelchair and talk about his week, about his kids, about the garden, about whatever came to mind. William would sometimes turn toward him. Sometimes his hand would find Daniel's without apparent intention, more reflex than recognition. Daniel had learned, across 2 years of Sundays, to consider that enough. Jennifer Coleman had been running therapy dog visits for 6 years by the time she brought Atlas to Maplewood for the first time. She had worked with 8 different dogs over those years, rotating through a roster of certified animals with varying temperaments and specialties, and she had learned that every facility had its own rhythm, its own emotional landscape. Memory care was different from assisted living. The residents here moved in a slower, more interior world. You had to meet them there. The dogs that worked best were the ones that understood patience, that didn't need immediate feedback, that could simply be present without demanding a response. Atlas was the best dog she had ever worked with. She wasn't sentimental about that assessment. It was professional. He had a stillness about him that was unusual for his size. 130 pounds of white fur that moved through a room with a kind of gravity-defying gentleness, like something that Large had learned very early, that it needed to be careful with the world around it. He had come to her through a rescue organization in Albany, pulled from a hoarding situation where he had been one of 11 Great Pyrenees living in conditions that the rescue coordinator described to Jennifer as survivable, barely. He had been underweight, his coat matted, his trust of strangers something that had to be rebuilt from scratch. It had taken Jennifer 8 months and a lot of patience to get him to certification. The transformation had been its own kind of story. The dog that arrived flinching from sudden movements and eating food in anxious gulps became, slowly and then all at once, one of the gentlest animals she had ever encountered. As if all that capacity for trust, denied and redirected for the first years of his life, had compressed into something singular. He didn't divide his attention across a room the way most therapy dogs did. When Atlas was with you, he was entirely with you, which was in principle a wonderful quality, and which became, in practice, a significant operational problem. The first visit to Maplewood was a Tuesday in September, early morning before the residents had their afternoon medications and the fatigue that came with them. Jennifer checked Atlas in at the front desk, clipped his therapy dog vest into place, and began the standard hallway route. He was perfect for the first 12 minutes. He accepted the greetings of 4 residents with gracious patience, allowed his ears to be examined by a man in room 104 who seemed to believe, with great conviction, that Atlas was his childhood dog Biscuit, and paused appropriately outside an open doorway where a woman in a pink housecoat was watching a morning game show. Then they turned the corner into the east wing, and Atlas stopped. Not a hesitation, not a distraction, a full, decisive, planted feet stop of the kind that Jennifer recognized from his early training days, the kind that meant he had made a decision and her opinion on the matter was noted, but not determinative. She followed his gaze. Halfway down the corridor, slightly ajar, was the door to room 317. She couldn't see much through the gap. The room was quiet. Morning light was coming through the window at the far end, hitting the wall at an angle that made the space look warm and suspended in time. Jennifer tugged gently at the leash. Alice did not move. She tugged again, not unkindly, with the small amount of force she used when redirecting him from something interesting on a walk. He leaned into it slightly, as if acknowledging the signal, and then continued not moving. "All right," Jennifer said quietly. "We'll see." Room 317 belonged to William Harris. He was in his wheelchair, near the window, positioned to catch the morning light, a position the nursing staff maintained by habit because someone months ago had noticed that he seemed more settled when the light was on his face. He was wearing gray slacks and a blue flannel shirt that his son had brought. His hands rested in his lap. His eyes were open, tracking nothing specific, or perhaps tracking something interior that no one else could see. Atlas walked in as if he had been here before. Not cautiously, not tentatively, not with the exploratory energy of a dog entering unfamiliar territory. He crossed the room directly, settled himself onto the linoleum beside William's wheelchair, and looked up at the old man's face. William didn't react. His eyes didn't shift. Nothing changed in his expression. Atlas waited. He was still waiting when Jennifer, after 6 minutes, tried to redirect him to continue the hallway visit. He glanced at her, the polite, apologetic glance of a dog acknowledging that he understood what was being asked of him and had chosen something else, and looked back at William. Jennifer stood in the doorway and watched for another 3 minutes. Alice did not move. William continued to look at nothing. And then, so gradually that Jennifer almost missed it, William's right hand drifted from his lap and came to rest on Atlas's head. It wasn't a petting motion. It wasn't deliberate. It looked like a plant turning toward light, unconscious, biological, following something the mind no longer had words for. His palms settled into the thick white fur behind Atlas's ears. Atlas went completely still. His eyes closed for a moment. Jennifer did not cry. She was a professional, and she had seen things at facilities like this, moments of connection that bypassed language entirely and reached something more fundamental. She had seen a man with advanced dementia suddenly perform a complicated guitar chord he had played at 18 when his granddaughter brought a ukulele to a visit. She had seen a woman who hadn't left her room in 2 months follow a therapy dog into the common room, as naturally as if she did it every day. But she had never seen a dog go still like that, like he had been waiting for something, and it had finally arrived. The protocol at Maplewood was clear. Therapy animals were to distribute attention across as many residents as possible during each session. The stated goal was 20 to 35 residents per visit, 5 to 10 minutes each, maximum emotional benefit distributed as broadly as possible. Jennifer had followed this protocol at every facility, with every dog for 6 years. Atlas destroyed the protocol on visit 1 and never looked back. She tried everything she could think of. She started the route in the West Wing, as far from room 317 as the floor plan allowed. Atlas walked cooperatively through 3 rooms, accepting attention from residents with his usual grace, and then began pulling east with the slow, inexorable pressure of a tide coming in. She tried keeping him in the common room, where morning activity group was meeting, hoping the density of residents would engage him broadly. He circulated for 7 minutes. She timed it, and then positioned himself at the door facing the east corridor. She tried arriving at 317 first and leaving at last, hoping that getting there early would satisfy whatever compulsion he felt. It didn't. He would complete the visit to William and then, when she moved to leave, would not leave. She tried bringing high-value treats. Atlas ate the treats, looked at her with what she could only describe as patient understanding, and returned his attention to William. On the 4th visit, Margaret Hoffman, the head nurse at Maplewood, stopped Jennifer in the hallway before she even reached the East Wing. "We need to talk about what's happening with room 317, she said. Margaret was in her mid-50s, experienced, and not easily given to either alarm or sentiment. She had been nursing for 28 years, the last 11 at Maplewood. She had seen enough to calibrate carefully between what mattered and what didn't. "I know," Jennifer said. "I've been trying to redirect him. He's not responding to standard techniques." "The other residents are noticing," Margaret said. "I've had 2 people ask me why the dog doesn't want to see them." One woman cried. Jennifer rubbed her face. "I know. I'm sorry. I don't have a good explanation. Can you work with him? Retrain the behavior?" "I've tried." Jennifer paused. "I've also been watching what happens when he's with William. I don't know how to say this without sounding like I've lost my professional judgment, but I don't think he's fixating randomly. I think he knows something we don't." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "William Harris hasn't spoken in 3 years, she said finally. "He shows minimal responsiveness to most stimuli. His son visits every Sunday, and William may or may not recognize him on any given week. His neurological trajectory has been consistent decline." She paused. "When your dog is with him, his heart rate is down 9 points on average. I've been running the numbers since your 2nd visit. His cortisol indicators on blood draws taken within 48 hours of therapy visits are lower than any comparable 2-week period in the last 18 months. Jennifer stared at her. "You've been tracking that." "I track everything," Margaret said. "It's my job." She was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't tell me what the dog knows, but it tells me that something is happening in that room that isn't happening anywhere else." They stood in the hallway for a moment, the sounds of the facility moving around them. The squeak of a cart down a distant corridor, a television somewhere playing morning news, the soft footsteps of the early shift. "What do you want me to do?" Jennifer asked. "Keep coming," Margaret said, "and keep bringing him to 317. We'll figure out the other residents separately." She turned to go, then turned back. "And don't retrain him. Whatever he's doing, let him do it." The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that Jennifer came to think of as proof that instinct has its own logic. Every Tuesday morning, Atlas arrived at Maplewood. Every Tuesday morning, he walked with Jennifer through enough of the other rooms to satisfy a loose interpretation of the broad distribution protocol. And every Tuesday morning, he settled himself beside William Harris's wheelchair and did not leave until Jennifer physically carried him out at the end of the visit, which, by the 6th week, she had stopped attempting. She stayed an extra hour. She sat in the chair by the window and worked on her phone and let Atlas do whatever Atlas was doing. What Atlas was doing, as best as Jennifer could observe, was simply being present. He didn't perform. He didn't nuzzle William repeatedly for effect or do the theatrical things that therapy dogs sometimes fell into when they sensed a handler wanted a response. He sat beside the wheelchair, and occasionally he rested his head in William's lap, and on those occasions William's hand would find the fur behind his ears with the same unconscious certainty it always had. Like muscle memory, like the body remembering something the mind had set down. Once, in late October, Jennifer looked up from her phone to find that William's lips were moving. No sound was coming out, but his lips were forming something, syllables, shapes, a sequence that repeated twice before stopping. Atlas's ears were forward. He was watching William's face with an attention so focused it looked almost pained. Jennifer held very still and did not speak and did not move, and the moment eventually ended. William's face returning to its habitual quiet, Atlas's ears settling back. She told Margaret about it the following week. Margaret pulled William's chart and cross-referenced it with the nursing notes from that shift. A nurse had noted that morning that William had seemed, quote, more agitated than usual, responsive to external sounds. It was the closest anyone had gotten to a note about vocalization in 8 months. "He was trying to say something," Jennifer said. "I don't know what, but he was trying." Margaret wrote something in the chart. "I know," she said. Daniel Harris came by the following Sunday, and Jennifer happened to be there, waiting to speak with Margaret about scheduling. She introduced herself in the hallway, explained briefly who she was and what she did. Daniel was a quiet man in his late 40s, clearly tired in the way that people with parents in memory care become tired, a sustained, accumulated fatigue that goes deeper than sleep. "The dog," Daniel said when she mentioned Atlas. "I've seen the name in the nursing notes. You're the one who brings him." "I am. He's taken a particular interest in your father. I wanted to ask, do you have any sense of whether your father had a strong bond with animals?" In his history, Daniel thought about it. "He liked dogs," he said finally. "Growing up, there was always a dog around." And he paused. "He was in Afghanistan for a few months in 2008. I don't know all the details. He didn't talk about it much. There was something about a dog there. I remember him mentioning it once to my mother, just once, and she said he got attached and then had to leave it behind. He was upset about it." Daniel shrugged. "That was a long time ago. I don't know if it's relevant." Jennifer thought about this on the drive home. Atlas was lying in the back, his usual post-visit quiet, the particular stillness that came after he had spent time with William. She watched him in the rearview mirror at a red light. "You know something, don't you?" she said, not really expecting an answer, not sure she would have known what to do with one. Atlas looked at the back of her headrest and said nothing. November came in cold and early that year in Vermont. By the second week of the month, The ground was frozen and the first real snow had fallen, and the maple trees outside Maplewood had gone bare and stark against a sky that couldn't decide between gray and white. The residents who could be taken outdoors had their outdoor time cut significantly. The facility took on the slightly compressed feeling of a winter ship. Warmth inside, isolation outside, a sense of the world having narrowed to the dimensions of these hallways and common rooms and carefully lit corridors. William Harris was moved from his wheelchair to a reclining chair in mid-November, a transition the staff made when residents required more postural support. He tolerated the change without visible distress, which the nurses took as a good sign. His Sunday visits with Daniel continued. His vitals remained stable, or as stable as could be expected. And every Tuesday morning, Atlas was there. Jennifer noticed, around this time, that Atlas had begun doing something she couldn't fully explain and didn't want to pathologize. On visits, once he had settled with William, he would periodically raise his head and check the room. Not in a distracted or anxious way, but in the methodical way of a dog that has assigned itself a watch. He would scan the corners. He would look at the door. He would look at the window. And then he would lower his head back to William's lap and resume his stillness. She mentioned this to Margaret. Margaret, who had been noting Atlas's effect on William in her quiet, meticulous way for weeks, simply nodded. "He's checking on him," she said, "making sure the room is secure." "You think a therapy dog is guarding a patient?" Margaret looked at her with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. "I think you should stop calling him a therapy dog," she said. "I don't know what he is, but it's not that." The night of November 19th began as most nights at Maplewood began. The dinner shift ended at 7. Medications were distributed at 8. The building settled gradually into its late evening quiet. Not silence exactly. The mechanical hum of a facility never fully silences, but a reduction of volume and activity that the residents, most of them, recognized as the approach of night. William Harris was in his room by 8:15, his reclining chair adjusted for overnight positioning, his blanket arranged over his legs. A nursing assistant checked on him at 9. He was awake, eyes open, as he often was at this hour. The TV in his room was set to a music channel that played instrumental pieces through the night. The staff had discovered, months ago, that William slept more steadily with music. They had noted this in his care plan. They checked the volume every evening. At 9:30, the assistant checked again. William was asleep. His breathing was regular. His color was normal. She noted the time in the chart, turned the TV volume down slightly, and left the room. Nothing happened for the next 4 hours. At 3:02 a.m., William Harris had a massive ischemic stroke. The blood supply to a significant portion of his left hemisphere was cut off. At 3:02, he lost consciousness. He did not fall. He was already reclined, but his breathing changed, becoming shallow and irregular, and the medical alert system embedded in his bed pad, set to respond to extended periods of abnormal movement detection, did not trigger. The alert would not trigger for another 13 minutes, when the pad's pressure sensors registered a subtle shift consistent with the system's emergency threshold. 13 minutes is a long time in stroke medicine. The critical treatment window, the period during which clot-dissolving medication can be administered with the highest probability of meaningful outcome, is 3 hours from symptom onset. Every minute inside that window matters. The difference between receiving emergency treatment at 13 minutes post-stroke versus 26 minutes post-stroke is not abstract. It is measurable. It is, in some cases, the difference between walking out of a rehabilitation facility and not. At 2:47 a.m., 15 minutes before William's stroke, 13 minutes before Atlas would arrive at Maplewood's door, Jennifer Coleman was asleep in her house in Shelburne, 8 miles away. Atlas was asleep on his dog bed in the mudroom off the kitchen. Jennifer had done her usual evening check before turning in. Water topped up, door latched, all standard. Atlas had seemed settled. He had been settled, as far as she knew, until 2:47. At 2:47, based on the timestamp of the outdoor security camera at the neighbor's house on the corner, Atlas exited the back door. The camera image was grainy in the darkness, but clear enough a large white shape moving at a deliberate, ground-eating trot, heading east without deviation. Jennifer discovered the open door at 6 a.m. when she came downstairs to find the mudroom empty. She called Maplewood at 6:07 before she called anyone else, which she couldn't entirely explain later. "I know this sounds strange," she told the overnight nurse who answered, "but did something happen? Is William Harris okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line that told her everything before the nurse said a word. What happened between 3:02 and 3:15 a.m. at Maplewood was reconstructed afterward from security footage, nursing notes, and the accounts of 4 staff members who were on shift that night. The overnight supervisor, a nurse named Kevin Morris, was doing a hallway check on the 2nd floor when he heard the noise from the entrance. He described it later as sounding like something large was trying to come through the glass, methodical and desperate at the same time. He went to the ground floor entrance and found Atlas at the front door, 130 pounds of white dog, fog breath clouding in the cold air, paws working at the glass with something Kevin said he had never seen in an animal before or since. Not panic, purpose. Kevin's first instinct was to shoo the dog away. He knocked on the glass. Atlas barked, once sharp, aimed directly at Kevin's face, and resumed clawing. A nursing assistant named Diane came down the hallway behind Kevin. "Isn't that the therapy dog?" Kevin looked more carefully at the dog's color, his size. "Could be," he said. "He shouldn't be here at 3 in the morning." "Something's wrong," Diane said. She said it quietly, not dramatically. Just stated it like a fact she had arrived at through some process she couldn't have named. Kevin stood for a moment looking at the dog. The dog looked back at him. The barking had stopped when Kevin stayed at the door, but the rest of Atlas had not stopped. His body was taut with something that radiated through the glass like a frequency. Kevin unlocked the door. Atlas went through it like water going through a gap, smooth and immediate, and turned for the stairwell. Kevin followed at a run. By the time he reached the 3rd floor, Atlas was already at the end of the east corridor, outside room 317, and the sound coming from him was not a bark. It was a howl, low and sustained, the kind of sound that vibrates in the chest of whoever hears it, something older than language. Kevin pushed past him into the room. William Harris was unconscious, his breathing shallow and wrong, his skin pallid in the dim light from the music channel screen. Kevin was already calling a code as he crossed to the bedside. Diane had followed him up and was on the phone for emergency services. The automated alert triggered at 3:15, 13 minutes after the stroke began. But Kevin Morris was already in the room at 3:09, 6 minutes earlier than the automatic system would have brought anyone. 6 minutes that, the neurologist on call said later, with the particular careful language of someone not wanting to overstate, but also not wanting to deny what the data showed, substantially improved the outcome parameters. William was stabilized. He was transported to UVM Medical Center. He survived. The story that Jennifer told people afterward, because people asked, because the night staff talked, because these things travel, was always incomplete. Not because she left anything out, but because the piece at the center of it remained beyond the reach of language. She knew the facts. She had replayed the neighbor's security footage until she had it memorized. 2:47 a.m., 8 miles. Atlas arriving at 3:02, a timing that should have been impossible, that corresponded to something it should have been impossible for a dog to perceive. She talked to a veterinary neurologist at UVM who was willing to engage seriously with the question. He spoke about canine olfaction, about the capacity of dogs to detect biochemical changes, cortisol spikes, specific compounds released by the body under acute cardiac or neurological stress, at extraordinary distances under the right conditions. He spoke about cases of dogs alerting to seizures moments before they occurred, to cancers invisible on imaging, to hypoglycemic events before any external sign had emerged. He chose his words carefully, the way good scientists do when the evidence exceeds the current theoretical framework. "What you're describing," he said finally, "is outside what we currently have a satisfying mechanistic explanation for. The distance, the timing, the fact that he went to a specific room in a specific building he'd never been to at night. None of that fits cleanly into what we understand about scent detection." He paused. "That doesn't mean there isn't an explanation. It means we don't have it yet. Jennifer drove home from that conversation and sat in her driveway for a while before going inside. Atlas was in the back seat, his head resting on the divider, watching her with those dark, quiet eyes. "What do you know?" she said. "What is it that you know?" Atlas exhaled slowly through his nose. She had been the one to go through William's belongings when Daniel, overwhelmed by the medical crisis and the logistics it created, asked the facility to help inventory and box up the room's personal items for temporary storage. Most of what she found was what she expected: books, a framed photograph of Carol, some correspondence, a handmade card from a grandchild, reading glasses in a case. She found the standard items of a well-lived, well-loved life. Objects that accumulated meaning through years in proximity and were now in boxes because their owner was in a hospital 3 miles away. At the bottom of the canvas bag in the closet, she found a cardboard box. Inside the box were photographs. She went through them carefully, the way you go through someone else's photographs, respectful, aware of the privacy of the thing, going quickly past the family images and the personal moments. Then she got to the ones from Afghanistan. William, in military context, was disorienting. She had only known him as a silent man in the reclining chair, and here he was younger, in his early 60s, but vigorous, standing outside structures she didn't recognize against landscapes that were obviously not Vermont. There were photographs of him with soldiers, with what appeared to be village children, with groups of men around tables. And then, near the bottom of the stack, there was a photograph that made her hands go still. William was kneeling in the dirt. He was in uniform, not military uniform, but the kind of practical civilian gear that aid workers wore, sturdy and dusty and appropriate to the climate. The setting was a forward operating base, identifiable from the structures in the background. He was kneeling, and in his arms he was holding a puppy, a Great Pyrenees puppy, white, with the thick, layered coat of the breed, with a broad head and the dark, deep-set eyes. And on the left shoulder, a marking, a patch of faintly darker fur in an irregular shape that Jennifer had looked at every Tuesday for months, that she would have recognized in her sleep. A marking she had photographed once for Atlas's certification records, because it was distinctive enough that veterinarians used it as a secondary identifier. She turned the photograph over. William had written on the back in a hand that was firm and clear, the hand of a man who had spent his life putting words on paper. Asterisk Kandahar, October 2008. Found outside the wire. Too young to leave behind. Asterisk. Jennifer sat down on the floor of William's room, still holding the photograph, in a facility that was quiet around her at 11 in the morning, while outside the Vermont mountains stood sharp and clear in the November air. She sat there for a long time. She told Daniel first, the following Sunday, when he came to the hospital. She had made a copy of the photograph, keeping the original in the box. She sat across from him in the hospital waiting area, the photograph on the table between them. Daniel stared at it for a long time without speaking. "My mother mentioned this once," he said finally, "that he found a dog. That was hard to leave it. The rescue organization that gave me Atlas, they pulled him from a hoarding situation in Albany," Jennifer said. "That was 4 years ago. They didn't have records going back further than that. He was already an adult. He was already whoever he is. You think he was that puppy? I don't know how to prove it. The markings are..." Jennifer shook her head. "I've looked at that photograph 50 times. I don't know how to say with certainty, but I've looked at those markings every week for months." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "He didn't recognize my father," he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. There was something searching in it. "He recognized something," Jennifer said. "Scent, maybe. Something the disease couldn't touch. Your father's voice is gone. His memories are..." She paused, finding the right words. "The memories of Atlas are gone, too. He can't tell you about a puppy in Kandahar. But I think his body remembered. His hands always found the fur. Every time." She paused. Atlas never forgot who he was looking for. Daniel pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment. He didn't say anything. They sat for a while in the hospital waiting area. A television in the corner was running a morning program with the sound down. Outside the window, the November light was the flat, even gray of a Vermont sky that had not decided anything yet. "There's something I've thought about since the stroke," Daniel said finally. "I've been coming every Sunday for 2 years. And he doesn't always know who I am. Some Sundays I can tell he knows, something in his face. Other Sundays he's polite, the way he was always polite to strangers. A professor's courtesy." He stopped. "But when you tell me that every Tuesday, every single week, without fail," his hand found the dog. "Without thinking. Just found him. Always," Jennifer said. Daniel was quiet for another moment. "He used to tell us, when we were kids, that the things you love deepest are the ones your hands remember." He almost smiled. He meant books. He was talking about books. He'd say you can always tell what someone truly loves by watching their hands. He looked at the photograph on the table. His hands found the dog. Jennifer didn't say anything. "He would have wanted to know," Daniel said again, more quietly. "The man he was someone who believed in paying debts, in keeping accounts. He would have been wrecked by the idea that he left something behind and never found out what happened to it." Daniel picked up the photograph and held it for a moment. "I think maybe he knows. I don't know how to say that in a way that makes sense. But I think maybe his hands know, and that's enough." Jennifer drove home with Atlas in the back, and she thought about what Daniel had said for the rest of that day and into the evening, while Atlas lay on his bed in the mudroom, and she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her. She thought about all the mechanisms she didn't have words for. She thought about the accumulated weight of research on implicit memory, on the body's knowledge that exists apart from the verbal machinery of consciousness. The pianist who can still play a piece he cannot name. The soldier who still flinches from a sound that his waking mind has cataloged as safe. The hands that find the fur of a dog they haven't held in 15 years because hands remember what the hippocampus has let go. She thought about Atlas, sitting at the door of the liaison office in Kandahar on an October morning in 2008, watching a man cross a yard and get into a vehicle. Watching with those dark, patient eyes. Watching until the vehicle was gone. And she thought about him waking up at 2:47 in the morning in Shelburne, Vermont, in a house 8 miles from a building he visited on Tuesdays, and simply going. "The Alzheimer's erases language first," Jennifer said quietly. "And then memory in the explicit sense, names, faces, context. But what I've been reading since all this happened, there's a body of research on implicit memory, on the kind of memory that isn't stored in the hippocampus, that isn't subject to the same deterioration. Motor memory, emotional memory, the memory of the body." She looked at the photograph. He might not have known, consciously, who Atlas was. He might not have been able to say the name, or the memory, or any of it. But something in his hands knew. Something in his body knew. She stopped herself. She was not a scientist. She was a woman who trained dogs and spent her Tuesdays in a memory care facility and had watched something she couldn't explain happen week after week in a room at the end of an East Corridor. "He survived," she said, "because of Atlas. Whatever the mechanism is, whatever the explanation is, he made it through that window." Daniel nodded slowly. He picked up the photograph and looked at it for a long time. His father, 21 years younger, kneeling in the dust of Kandahar, holding a white puppy with his whole body turned toward it. His face caught in the particular unguarded expression of a man who does not yet know he is being photographed. "He would have wanted to know this," Daniel said. "The man he was, he would have wanted to know that the dog came back." "Maybe some part of him does," Jennifer said. William Harris spent 11 days in the hospital. His recovery was partial. Strokes at his age, at his stage of decline, don't offer complete restitution. But he regained some respiratory stability, some color, some of the vitals that the neurologist had been guardedly positive about from the first night. The damage was real and lasting. But he was alive. He came back to Maplewood on a Thursday morning in late November. The facility had decorated for the holidays, small wreaths on the doors, lights in the common room windows, the smell of something baking in the kitchen mixing with the usual facility scent. His room was as he had left it. His belongings returned to their places, the music channel set to his usual station. Jennifer brought Atlas the following Tuesday. She had not been back since the night of the stroke, and she arrived with a complicated mixture of professional calm and something she was not quite ready to name. She checked in at the front desk, accepted the smiles and the quiet acknowledgement from the staff who knew what had happened, and walked Atlas to the East Corridor. He did not hesitate at the doorway. He walked in, as he always had, crossing the room directly to the reclining chair where William was settled, and lowered himself to the floor beside it with the unhurried certainty of something returning to its place. William's hand found the fur behind Atlas's ears. Jennifer stood in the doorway for a moment and watched. Atlas's eyes were closed. William's breathing was audible, slower than she remembered, a little labored still but steady. The music channel was playing something instrumental, something with strings, something that moved through the room like weather. She sat down in the chair by the window. Outside, the first real snow of winter was coming down, soft and even, settling on the bare branches of the maples and covering the ground in the particular way that Vermont snow covers things, completely without negotiation, making everything underneath it suddenly equal. She thought about a professor in a room in Kandahar in October of 2008, kneeling in the dust with a white puppy who had appeared from somewhere outside the wire, too young to survive on his own, too alive to leave behind. She thought about all the years between then and now. The puppy growing, changing hands, finding his way through a world that was not always kind, arriving at a rescue in Albany, arriving at Jennifer's door, arriving at Maplewood, arriving every Tuesday at room 317 with a certainty that she had spent months trying to understand and had finally stopped trying to explain. Some things are beyond the reach of explanation. Some things are just true. She thought about William's hands, always finding the fur, the body remembering what the mind had set down. She thought about what it means to save something, about the debt that creates not a burden, not an obligation, but a bond, a thread, something that persists through distance and time and change, and even through the slow erosion of everything we think of as the self. Atlas had found William across 8 miles of dark road at 3 in the morning. He had arrived 13 minutes before the machines knew to ask for help. He had howled outside the door until a nurse came, and the nurse had come, and William had been given the gift of those critical minutes, and those minutes had been enough. The boy who found a puppy outside the wire in Kandahar could not remember him anymore. The Alzheimer's had taken all of that, the name he had given him, the feel of him, the difficulty of leaving. All of it gone, or submerged beyond retrieval. But Atlas remembered. Atlas had always remembered. And in whatever language dogs use when the words we've taught ourselves have run out, in scent, in proximity, in the simple act of showing up and refusing to leave, he had said every Tuesday the thing that mattered most. Asterisk, I know you. I haven't forgotten. I'm here. Asterisk. If stories like this one have touched something in you, the kind of connection that lives beneath language, the bond that persists when everything else is faded, I hope you'll subscribe to Feral Soul Stories by Marcus Cole. These aren't stories I tell because they're easy. I tell them because they're true, and because truth like this deserves to be witnessed. Join our community. Every week, another story that reminds us how much we don't yet understand about love. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after William came back to Maplewood, because the story didn't end with the stroke, and it didn't end with the photograph. Stories about real bonds never end cleanly. They continue, and they change, and sometimes they give you one more thing. 3 weeks after William returned from the hospital, on a Tuesday morning in mid-December with the snow coming down heavy and gray outside the third-floor windows, Jennifer arrived with Atlas for their weekly visit. The hallway was quiet. The holiday decorations were still up, a small wreath on William's door, the same as all the others. Atlas walked in, crossed to the chair, lowered himself down, and William Harris said, in a voice that was rough with disuse and barely above a whisper, a voice that Margaret would later describe as sounding like something coming up from a long way underwater. Good boy. 2 words, the first he had spoken in 3 years. Jennifer did not move. She did not breathe. She was afraid that any disturbance would close the window that had opened. Atlas raised his head and looked at William. His tail, for the first time in all of Jennifer's careful observation, moved. A slow, single wag, as if he was being careful with emotion, as if he understood that this was not a moment for enthusiasm, but for something quieter. William's eyes were open. They were not tracking the room or the light through the window or the patterns of movement that they usually followed. They were fixed on Atlas. Something in them was different. Not the full return of whoever he had been, not the restoration the disease had taken, but present. A thread of the present making contact with something, reaching across the accumulated silence of 3 years to find 2 words that still existed somewhere in the wreckage, that the body remembered even when everything else had gone. "Good boy," he said again. Atlas put his head back down in William's lap. Jennifer finally breathed. William Harris did not make a full recovery. That is not the kind of story this is, and I won't pretend otherwise. He remained at Maplewood. He remained mostly silent. 2 words were not a reopened door. They were, as Jennifer came to think of them, a message. A moment when the thing underneath managed, just once more, to reach the surface. He would not lecture again. He would not remember his students' names or the books he had spent his life teaching. He would not recognize Daniel every Sunday, or the grandchildren who came at Christmas, or the photographs of Carol on the windowsill. But on Tuesday mornings, when Atlas came through the door of room 317, something happened in William Harris's face that the nurses started calling, quietly among themselves, the light. Not a medical term, not in any chart, just the thing they saw, the thing you can see in a human being when something that has been gone a long time comes briefly back. His hands always found the fur. Alice always stayed. The photograph from Kandahar hangs now in a frame on Jennifer's wall at home, next to the certification placard that lists Atlas's credentials and the photograph of him on his first official therapy visit. William kneeling in the dust, a white puppy in his arms. A moment in October 2008 that neither of them could have known would extend across 15 years, across a war and a life and a disease that takes everything to arrive at a room in Vermont where a dog was waiting. Some debts aren't paid. They're kept, carried, returned not as currency, but as presence, as the willingness to show up at 3 a.m. if necessary, 8 miles if necessary, against every protocol and every expectation, because a long time ago someone knelt in the dirt and made a choice, and some part of the world remembered. Atlas remembered. He remembered for both of them. And I've been doing this for 25 years, traveling the world, collecting these stories, sitting with the evidence of bonds that shouldn't exist, that don't fit the frameworks we've built to make sense of animal behavior, that persist across time and distance, and even across the kind of forgetting that medicine has no cure for. And I still don't have a clean explanation for what happened in Shelburne, Vermont, at 2:47 in the morning on the 19th of November. I have the security footage. I have the timestamps. I have the photograph from Kandahar and the nursing notes and a neurologist's careful language about critical windows and treatment outcomes. I have all the pieces, but what I keep coming back to is not the mechanism. It's the simplicity of it. A boy found a puppy outside the wire and took him in, and 15 years later, when the boy was old and silent and the world had taken most of what he was, the dog came back, traveled 8 miles in the dark, arrived at the door, and would not stop until someone opened it. Because that is what love does. Not the love that requires recognition or reciprocity or the ability to say a name. The other kind. The kind that is older and quieter and does not ask what it is owed. The kind that just shows up. That is the love Atlas carried across 8 miles of Vermont roads in the middle of the night. That is the love William's hands remembered, even when everything else was gone. That is the story. If you stayed with me to the end of this one, thank you. These are the stories that stay with me long after I've finished telling them, and I hope they stay with you too. Tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed an animal do something that you couldn't explain? A bond that shouldn't have been possible? I want to hear your stories. They matter, every single one of them. And before you go, I have 2 more stories I think you'll carry with you. Each one is a reminder that the connections between humans and animals reach places nothing else can reach. Click on either one. I promise you won't regret it.